Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Paradise was far from what I expected. By TStewatGardner. About 5 years ago, I was privileged to live on the beautiful island of Oahu for several years with my husband, who was stationed there at the time. Not only was I elated to spend several years under waving palms, sunny skies, and deep turquoise beaches, I also had personal family ties to the island. Years earlier, my grandfather was stationed there on that fateful day in December when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Although his ship was one of those receiving less damage, and he survived unscathed, 2 of his crewmates were not as fortunate. My grandmother told me that when he returned from his deployment after the war, he was a haunted ghost of a man that he used to be. He carried the weight of that day on his back until it slowly crushed his soul, constantly wishing he could go back and rewrite his actions that day so he could somehow help his fallen comrades. Although his body had returned, my grandmother once explained tearily, his heart was still on the island. He passed away tragically only a few short years later in a mysterious house fire that also took nearly all of my grandparents' belongings. For my whole life, I wanted to honor my grandfather by going back to Hawaii and paying homage at the site where so many people were lost that day. I hoped in some way to reach back through the years to connect with the man I'd never had the opportunity to know. Within a few weeks of moving to the island, I was offered and accepted a position as the office administrator for a small, local advertising firm. My new office was located in historic downtown Honolulu, in an old but architecturally stunning suite of rooms, housed in a former transportation building. The building was known for its large, sweeping stone archways, an ornate lobby, gilded with gold leaf, inlay elevator doors, and detailed tile floors. Our office was located near the top of the building, overlooking the narrow, busy street below. The space was filled with several small offices, fronted by a small reception area, with my small office located to the left, and a combination break and conference room on the right. Although much of the building had been retrofitted with drywall and more modern interior touches, our part of the building remained much as it must have looked originally, with the exception of the added electrical wires hidden in industrial pipes. The large arched ceilings and doorways served as a beautiful backdrop to the work area, although I noticed that in some places the whitewash paint was chipping badly, and a few of the aging red interior bricks were coming loose. In my new role as the office administrator, I quickly realized that I was the last stop for last-minute presentation that had to be printed or bound for a client review the following day, and as such, I frequently left the office later than my colleagues. As the streets of this part of Honolulu were well lit and populated with a myriad of other office workers, I felt completely safe and actually enjoyed working a little later in hopes that I could time my departure to catch another glorious sunset on my walk home. That is, until the sound started late one evening. I was engrossed in an exceptionally large presentation. I was binding for an early breakfast meeting the next day when I heard what sounded like footsteps pattering down the hall, and children whispering in the next room. Assuming one of my coworkers must still be in their office, I tiptoed down the short hall, peeked through each door, and the chatter growing louder with each step, until I could hear them coming from the last office on the right. Laughing to myself, I swung into the doorway, exclaiming, "Angela, I didn't know you were here so late." But the last part of the sentence fell dead in my mouth. The minute my head peeked around the corner, the sounds completely stopped. The room was dark and deadly still, except for her pen cup, which had been knocked over. I picked up the pens and went back to the front of the office, unnerved, trying to make sense of what I knew I'd heard. Hoping for some human contact, I stepped out into the hallway and almost ran into one of the maintenance men, causing him to drop a bottle of cleaning polish he was carrying. Jarred for a second time, in as many moments, I stammered, "I'm so sorry." His mouth widened into a broad smile, and he laughed, shaking his head. "No harm done," he responded generously, retrieving his bottle of polish. He paused for a moment. His eyes locked on mine, and I saw a glimmer of something I couldn't quite place. Then he nodded and continued down the dark hall, whistling as he walked. Still unsettled from the whole experience, I decided it was best to go back inside and finish my collating and get out of that place. Within a half hour, the binders were neatly stacked in our conference space, and I'd secured and locked the office door, seeing and hearing nothing and no one as I exited the building. A month or so passed, and the memory of whispers and footsteps nearly faded from my mind entirely, until I was working late alone one night, earbuds in, jamming to my favorite playlist as I made some spelling changes to some slides. Suddenly, from the direction of the break room, I heard a loud crash and jolted upright. A strange tingling in my stomach. I yanked my earbuds out of my ears and thought I heard a strange, pattering sound running down the hall. As my mind grappled for rational explanation, I hurried toward where the crashing noise had emanated from. Entering the break room, my fingers fumbled for the switch, and I flicked on the bright, overhead fluorescent lights, bracing myself. The room was silent and empty, with the exception of my favorite coffee mug, which lay shattered in the middle of the floor. I stepped towards the mug, my mind in a game of tug-of-war between fear and rationality. I was certain I had washed the cup and placed it in the rack only an hour before, but perhaps I had left it on the edge of the counter, where the vibration of traffic eventually caused it to shake off the countertop. As I gingerly picked up the broken shards of my fractured mug, I noticed something strange. On the broken handle there appeared to be small but smudged handprints. I discarded the mug's remains and hurried back to my desk, opening my browser and typing "Ghost of Children" into my search bar. Then, seeing the results were too wide, narrowed it by adding Hawaii. The results that popped up were far from what I expected. Instead of stories of a past child or, as I would have preferred, nothing at all, my page filled with results for a creature called a menehune. The menehune, according to legend, were small, dwarf-like creatures native only to Hawaii, known for their skills with craftsmanship and building. According to some, they were similar to Irish leprechauns or elves, but according to other legends, they had far more sinister a side. Several stories describe them as volatile and unpredictable, known to grow quite upset and aggressive if they felt their space was being invaded. In a few disturbing stories, they had been linked to unexplained deaths and disappearances. I continued scrolling down the page, gnawing worriedly on my fingernails as story after story of the Manahune's mischief filled my screen, when I was startled by a scratching sound behind me. Nearly flying out of my chair, I turned around and again saw nothing until I looked at the floor and noticed a small pile of brick dust and paint chips. My eyes tracked upwards. I noticed that one of the loose bricks appeared to have moved another half an inch outward. I could swear I was seeing it begin to shift slightly when I heard a pounding on the door to the office lobby. Breaking my trance, I sprinted to the reception area, relieved that someone, anyone, was here to distract me. Standing in the door was the same maintenance man I'd seen the previous month, still holding a bottle of polish and a rag. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, "but we have to turn the power off to this floor to fix a light fixture that was vandalized. I'm happy to escort you out, if you like." Relieved to have an excuse to leave the building, I asked if he would mind waiting a few seconds while I gathered my purse and laptop. He nodded politely, and with a rush of relief I grabbed my things and joined him back in the hall. He must have noticed my anxiety. As we stepped into the ornate elevator, he asked with concern in his voice, "Are you okay? I really hope I didn't startle you." "Yes," I confirmed, willing myself to keep my mouth shut and not sound like a total idiot. Instead, I heard my voice start stammering about my experiences from the past couple of months. The broken mug, the handprint, and the moving brick. Feeling more foolish with every second, he said very little until we exited the elevator. But as we stepped out, he nodded, and with carefully measured words, told me a short story that chilled me to the bone. "About 30 years ago," he began, "the building was renovated for more office space. Although most of the suites were upgraded with drywall and hidden electrical," he explained, "half the floor your suite shared with 2 others could never be renovated. Every day the workers would come in to find everything they'd completed had been completely torn down, and half their tools had gone missing. Finally, in frustration, one of the foremen decided to stay overnight to put an end to the mischief." He hesitated, as though reconsidering whether he should continue, but then resumed. "The next morning, when the workers returned, the foreman had disappeared, as had all the tools and supplies, never to be heard from again." He swallowed and continued, "Only in the past year had that part of the building been open to tenants, and even then, with only minimal modifications to the architecture." He stared at me seriously, and I could tell that even if the story was urban legend, he truly believed every word. Feeling dizzy and my heart pounding with fear, I reached out to shake his hand goodbye. As I shook it, I felt an odd, familiar tingling that I couldn't place. As he let go of my hand, he added, "Be very careful. I'm always here late, so feel free to come and find me if you ever feel scared again." I realized that a stranger's interest in me should seem disturbing in its own right, but something about his vibe and his demeanor calmed me. "Thank you," I acknowledged, smiling slightly. I ran more than walked home that night, and arrived at my apartment sweaty and out of sorts. Although I'd intended to keep my stories to myself, my husband picked up on my unease almost immediately. I tried to brush it off as a busy day at work, but he wasn't fooled. So for a second time in the past hour, I heard myself tell my story again. adding in the even more chilling tale the maintenance man had told me. My poker-faced husband did his best to take me seriously, but I could see he thought I was overreacting, or at least over-imagining. Wise man that he was, he poured me a large glass of wine. Before sitting on the couch next to me, he placed his arm around my shoulder and took a deep breath. "Look," he said, "it's an old building. Pipes are going to echo, gulls tap on the window. The ground shakes every time a large truck drives by. If things didn't bang and shift, it would be abnormal." My mind wanted to agree, but my gut churned in warning. "What about the remodeling crew?" I countered, trying to find some part of the narrative that would make me sound somewhat rational. He chuckled. "Even if it was true," he said with a knowing smile, "I bet if you saw the surf reports for that week, you'd know exactly why they needed a story to explain why no work was getting done, and people quit every day. Who knows, maybe the foreman stole the supplies and started his own gig." He shrugged. I had to admit that all made far more sense than evil elves taunting me for no reason. The next morning I pulled up my big girl pants, so to speak, and went to the office. I tried to ask my coworkers if they'd ever encountered anything similar, without sounding as though I was making up elaborate stories not to stay at work. None of them either confirmed or denied anything, although I noticed that Angela always made a point of leaving by 4:30. One of my other coworkers just laughed. "Everything's haunted here," he said noncommittally, then launched into several local legends about various creatures and hauntings. I wished I'd never asked. However, after a few weeks without further incident, my nerves finally calmed down, and I was able to get through the day without jumping every time my phone dinged or a door slammed. Even then, I was careful to find a reason to leave on time and make sure I was never the last one in the office. I occasionally noticed brick dust and paint chips on the floor around my desk, and would occasionally pass the maintenance man in the hall, where we'd both nod and smile. But once again, time slowly washed away the memory and fear, allowing for calming rationale to take the wheel. About 2 months later, on a rare, cool, and rainy Hawaiian day, 3 of my 4 coworkers were on site with a client when my remaining companion announced that her son had gotten sick at school and she needed to leave early for the day. Before I even had a chance to consider the news, I found myself alone again in the office. I resolutely picked out my happiest playlist, plugged in my earbuds, and forced myself to focus on the work in front of me. As I was hunched over my keyboard, clicking away, I felt a sudden, sharp crack on the back of my head. I screamed in pain and surprise, reaching for my scalp. In horror, my fingers came back covered in sticky red blood. Looking down, I noticed the loose brick now laying at my feet. Again, my brain tried to rationalize, but before I could come up with a plausible explanation for a brick shooting itself 3 feet out from the wall, another brick hurled down, hitting me on the shoulder. I looked up at the wall, seeking an explanation for the onslaught, and in the opening left behind, I gasped as I saw what I could have sworn was a small set of glowing eyes. I cried out again, this time in terror more than pain, and ran for the door. As I reached for the handle, another brick crashed down, smashing my hand as it secured around the knob. I jumped back, crying, as the door flung open, and there stood the maintenance man, polish still in hand. Without question, he grabbed my arm and half pushed, half dragged me out of the office. We stood in the hall, me out of breath with terror, him steadying me. I slammed the elevator button frantically, my panic rising as I could hear the grinding and halting of the car above and below me. None of them seemed to want to stop at my floor. After what seemed like hours, the door dinged and creaked open ever so slowly, as though taunting me for my impatience. I entered, heart thumping as the doors hesitated before closing, and the car creaked its way downward, again pausing as my panic rose before the doors rattled open. I ran choking and sobbing into the night, pulling the normalcy of the chilly rain and evening traffic around me, as though it were a warm security blanket. The next morning, I woke to a horrifying headline. A woman in the suite next to mine had been killed when two of the interior walls mysteriously collapsed on top of her, her skull so crushed she could barely be identified. There was no evidence of any crime, but I knew better. My stomach churned violently, and I barely made it to the restroom in time to lean over the commode. Spewing my morning coffee and the previous night's dinner, all I could think about was the maintenance man pulling me out of the office, and I wondered if he had really been only moments before the same fate as that poor woman they found dead. In response to the tragedy, the building immediately closed my floor to determine the cause of the architectural failure, and we were all given unexpected vacation from work. Needing to take my mind off the whole event, and realizing that I had been on the island for nearly a full year without ever visiting Pearl Harbor, I decided to make a day out of it, visiting the monument. I woke early and joined the first tour, humbled and horrified by the events of that tragic day, holding the grandfather I had never met close to my heart. As I solemnly absorbed the monument, I tried to imagine him, but having never seen a picture due to everything being destroyed in my grandparents' house fire, I could only imagine a vague young sailor smiling in his white cap. I finished up the tour with a trip through one of the gift shops, where I found an intriguing coffee table book full of pictures from Pearl Harbor, focusing on the lives of the seamen who had been stationed there. As I turned through the pages, I was suddenly jolted with recognition. In a rare candid black and white was a picture of 3 sailors cleaning the ship deck. They were laughing and smiling at the camera, holding rags and cleaning supplies. But it was the man in the middle who nearly made my heart stop beating. It was, without any doubt, the maintenance man from my office building. I read the caption, the sailor's name listed from left to right. There, in the middle, was my grandfather's name. So quoth this raven. I really enjoyed this story, my darlings. TStewatGardner did a fabulous job. Such a wonderful example of folklore and ghost story together. Thank you so much for coming to listen to it. And a special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Charlotte Emerson, Ermin Case, Darren and Jennifer, and Laura. If you like this, please hit the little button to let me know. If you didn't, hit the little button to let me know. Leave a comment. I'm always glad to talk with you, my darlings. I'm open to suggestions and criticisms, critiques. If you have not subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will talk to you next time, my darlings. Farewell.